Lep pozdrav vsem skupaj. Začenjamo mednarodno konferenco z naslovom Človekovo dostojanstvo in prostovoljno končanje življenja, ki ga organizirata skupaj Inštitut za bioetiko na Teološki fakulteti in Združenje bioetikov v Srednji Evropi, ki ima svoj sedež na Dunaju. Vesel sem, da se nas je toliko zbralo tukaj v predavalnici številka 2 in tudi kar nekaj sodelujočih je preko povezave Zoom. Pred nekaj dnevi je bila objavljena novica, da so pobudniki zakona o pomoči pri prostovoljnem končanju življenja zbrali 5000 podpisov, kar je pogoj, da oddajo zakon v parlamentarno proceduro. Predlog zakona je že sprožil razpravo o vprašanjih ob koncu življenja in odnosu družbe do umirajočih. Odzvali so se predvsem zdravniki, pa tudi Komisija pravičnosti in mir pri Slovenski škofovski konferenci. Po drugi strani pa pobudniki zakona vseskozi poudarjajo, kako je zakon napisan tako, da bo onemogočil vsako zlorabo. Tudi, če bi bil zakon popoln in bi onemogočil zlorabe, bi še vedno tak zakon sprožil korenite spremembe v družbi, predvsem spremenjen pogled na vrednost človekovega življenja. Katero življenje je še tako kakovostno, tako, kot oni rečejo, dostojanstveno, da ga je vredno živeti. Kot Teološka fakulteta želimo prispevati k širši razpravi v družbi in razmišljati o tem, kako se soočiti z vprašanji trpljenja, umiranja in smrti. Zavedamo se, da gre za teme, ki niso najbolj privlačne in nas večkrat navdaja strah, ko se soočimo s temi vprašanji. Zato me veseli, da ste se predavatelji z veseljem odzvali našemu povabilu in da bomo lahko skupaj razmišljali o teh vprašanjih. 4 sklopi so predvideni. Prvič mednarodne izkušnje. Predvsem bomo videli položaj v Avstriji, ki je z letošnjim letom uveljavila zakon o pomoči pri samomoru. Potem dialog z medicino in pravom. 3. sklop pokosilo je z področja teološke etike in zadnji sklop z področja duhovnosti in bivanjskega izkustva. Želim, da bi današnji dan potekal v dialoškem in konstruktivnem duhu. I just want to welcome also all the international guests and to express my gratitude to the members of the Association of Bioethicists in Central Europe who participate at this conference, and I'm really honored that our friendship has already given a lot of fruit in the past year, and I'm happy that your contribution now in the debate on euthanasia in Slovenia will be very welcome to clarify what this new law can bring for the future of life in Slovenia. So now I would like to invite our dean to say some words of welcome.
Našemu profesorju Romanu Globokarju, ki je pobudnik in organizator, in hvala seveda tudi Inštitutu za bioetiko na naši fakulteti in Srednje Evropskemu združenju bioetikov, zato ker Teološka fakulteta je vedno jemala človeka v polni podobi, vedno vse tiste razsežnosti, ki pristoji dostojanstvu osebe. In vsaka sprememba v družbi vodi vedno znova do spremembe tudi v odnosu do človeka. In prav je, če drugega ne, da premislimo in vidimo, kam gremo, in to ali dolgoročno res pomaga človeku na poti do dostojanstva, tistega, ki je na teološki fakulteti še posebej tudi v božjih očeh, ne samo človeških, ali pa ga ruši. Krhkost človeške osebe je tista, ki nas spodbuja, in hvala vsem udeležencem, ki boste s svojimi prispevki, svoje mislijo pomagali, da bo zakon, kakršenkoli že bo, res sprejet v korist tudi prihodnjim rodovom, ne samo tem ljudem, ki danes morda trpijo, ampak predvsem tistim, ki še prihajajo, ki smo na poti do tega, in to je vprašanje za vse nas, kaj in kako bomo človeka ohranjali vsej njegovem dostojanstvu. Hvala vsem, ki ste se udeležili, in vam želim uspešno delo.
Good morning, everybody. I'm Sigrid Müller, and I'm speaking now on behalf of the Association of Bioethicists in Central Europe. I would like to say thank you for inviting us to cooperate in this very important workshop. The association has been a connection of bioethicists from different Central European countries for now 15 years, and it is interdisciplinary because it thinks that today ethics is something like a joint venture, that everybody who has goodwill needs to cooperate to shape our society in a good way. Our society, our association, holds biannual conferences, and we try to look at what we share as humane interests in society, in our ethical concerns, and to look also at how historical experiences have shaped our awareness of these bioethical issues, and where there are differences and where we can enrich each other. So I'm very, very honored to be today with you and to speak to you, and I wish us all participants, all speakers, a very fruitful day and a fruitful cooperation also in the future.
People who greeted us today on this meeting. And without further ado, we can start with the first session of this conference with the international experience. As Professor Globokarja mentioned, we're starting in Austria. Our first lecturer today is Professor Johann Platzer. He's a moral theologian and a lecturer of applied ethics at the Karl Franzens University in Graz. He also teaches medical ethics at the Medical University of Graz and is a member of the Ethics Committee of the University Clinic. His lecture today is titled The Austrian Act on Assisted Suicide and its Application, Challenges After 1 Year. So, Professor Platzer, I would now like to give you.
Yeah, dear Roman, thank you very much for the invitation, and best greetings from Graz to Ljubljana. We have no sun in Graz. This is only a picture from the university. I hope you can see my slides. Is it okay? Okay. Since January 2022, assisted suicide has been permitted in Austria under certain circumstances. And today, first of all, I would like to briefly introduce the Austrian assisted suicide law. And then I would like to talk about practical challenges, especially for Caritas Austria, the palliative medicine, and I will also give some statistics. First, how did the law come about? In 2019, 4 claimants brought an action before the Austrian Constitutional Court. They demanded the lifting of the ban on active euthanasia and the lifting of the ban on assisted suicide. In November 2020, the Austrian Constitutional Court deliberated on this and lifted the ban on assisted suicide. The ban on active euthanasia was not lifted, but, and this is important, only for formal reasons. It is therefore to be expected that further lawsuits will follow. Then on January 1st in 2022, the law came into force. In November 2020, I go back to the second step. The Constitutional Court argued as follows. It is unconstitutional to prohibit any form of assisted suicide without exception. And now it's important for today. The Constitutional Court based its arguments on the basis of the right of self-determination and human dignity. You can see this in point 2. The right to self-determination includes not only the right to shape one's own life, but also the right to die with dignity. We can ask, what is dignity, with kind of dignity, and to choose the manner and time of death. The right to assisted suicide is only given when there is a free and self-determined decision. Therefore, the state has the right to duty to protect vulnerable groups. The government has also allocated funds for the development of palliative care. Now, what are the main contents of the law? Firstly, who is allowed to commit assisted suicide? The person must be an Austrian citizen. The minimum age is 18 years. And now it's important, I think, the person must be suffering from an incurable terminal illness, or he or she must be suffering from a serious chronic illness with persistent symptoms. The state of suffering must be hopeless and unbearable. I think the last point is very controversial. What exactly means a hopeless and intolerable state of suffering? And it's also important, the law makes no distinction between physical and mental illness. In principle, mentally ill people who have the capacity of making a decision are not excluded from assisted suicide. However, a detailed examination by doctors is necessary. Now, the implementation, I will show you the implementation in 4 steps. There are 4 parts. First is the medical part. Medical information with 2 doctors, and one of whom must have a palliative qualification. And the doctors must determine the patient's capacity, and in case of doubt, a psychiatrist must be consulted. Then the second part, after 12 weeks, now they can draw up a document. It's called in Austria a Sterbeverfügung. Maybe you can say in English, a disposition to die. This is drawn up by a notary public at the earliest after 12 weeks. This period is considered necessary by suicide researchers in order to overcome crisis phases. I don't know if it's so. For people in the terminal phase, who therefore have only a very short time to live, for example, a few weeks, the period is much shorter, namely 2 weeks. The notary must also redetermine the capacity to make decisions. The drawing up of the document is recorded in an electronic register. It is important to emphasize that neither the consulting doctors nor the notary are, by law, persons providing assistance. Now, the third step, the public pharmacy. The lethal preparation can then be collected from a public pharmacy within 1 year, either by a person wishing to die or by an assisting person named in the document. The pharmacist must document the dispensing of the drug in an electronic register. And it's important, maybe the pharmacist is also an assisted person by law. And now I come to the fourth. step, the place of death. Now the drug may or may not be taken by the patient. The place of death should be chosen by the patient. It can be taken orally or intravenously. After the assisted suicide has been carried out, the coroner must enter the cause of death in the electronic register. Now, I would like to ask some critical question. There has been criticism that there is no obligatory psychological counseling. And there are also some ambiguities in case of serious mental illness. It's not everything clear. And what exactly does hopeless and intolerable suffering mean? Next point is also important. I have taught it before. Are the restrictions constitution to possible new lawsuits? It is likely that there will be an expansion to active euthanasia in the coming years. Does the new law represent a paradigm shift, maybe from the duty to resist to the duty to assist? And what are the concrete consequences for church health and social institution? Now, point 2, I will come to practical challenges and first experiences. First, Caritas Austria. In the first step, Caritas Austria and the Austrian Conference of Religious Orders developed a so-called orientation framework for Catholic healthcare facilities and social care institutions. The aim was to create security for both the healthcare institution and the staff in dealing with the topic of assisted suicide in their institution. Now, I would like to share with you some quotes from the so-called orientation framework. I think it's better you can read this point. You see, assisted suicide is not provided in our facilities, and neither counseling services for the implementation of assisted suicide, nor the establishment of conduct of participation in office of assisted suicide. And it's also important, we do not allow our staff to be present at the time of assisted suicide. If you want, I can send these slides to Roman and he can use it for you. One point more, I think it's important for chaplains and pastoral caregivers. You can read. It's prohibited from being present at the time of assisted suicide by chaplains. And this prohibition has given rise to discussion among many chaplains and pastoral care workers, since the presence by law is not a matter of assistance, of course, but only accompaniment. The main points of these orientation frameworks were then implemented by the Catholic institution in the form of guidelines and service instruction. I also worked with this in this implementation. This poses a number of challenges for Caritas, for example. Many things are still open. Also, the implementation is officially forbidden. There will still be requests from resistance, of course. From a legal point of view, this resistance cannot simply be forced to leave the home. And what if the resistance have no relatives? Where will be they taken? One result of the implementation at Caritas Steiermark was the following. I only give you one example. In the case of a specific request, a decision will be made on an individual basis. You can read, this is from the Caritas of Styria in March 2022 paper. If the wish for assisted suicide becomes firm, a reflection group is set up together with the manager to deal with the individual situation. The reflection group is always composed as follows: a manager and a second member of staff from the institution. It's the head of nursing, a palliative care doctor, someone from the ethics department, and a member of the board of directors. Till now, it was we didn't use this paper because there were no requests, no concrete requests in the Caritas home. Now I will show you some statistics. There are different statistics for the first year after the introduction of the law. First, the Ministry of Social Affairs and Health reported that by December 2020, a total of 111 documents had been issued for the purpose of a disposition to die. 90 lethal preparations, natrium pentobarbital, will be dispensed in pharmacies. The Ministry of Health reports that by December 2020, less than 10 people have carried out assisted suicide with natrium pentobarbital. But the Ministry of Health has not provided for any accompanying scientific research on assisted suicide. And therefore, the Austrian Palliative Society introduced an electronic reporting system in May 2022. It now collects the data itself. A total of 83 reports were received, and there was a striking number of inquiries from women. Women are more likely to outlive their partners, and women often suffer from aloneness. They are also more likely to experience poverty in depressions in old age. They are therefore one of the most vulnerable groups. This is also in line with experiences in other countries. There were reports of 23 assisted suicide carried out. You can see these figures differ from those reported by the Ministry of Health. They said less than 10. The majority took place in private, as intended by law, and there were 3 assisted suicide in a nursing home and 1 assisted suicide in the hospice. And no case has yet been reported from a hospital. 1 assisted suicide was cancelled. There were 59 requests for assisted suicide, and almost 60% of these people decided not to draw up a document. This is important. After extensive counseling about palliative care options. I think this is an important point and shows the need for open counseling. The age of the patients survived ranged from 43 to 97 years. And now, what diseases did the patients suffer from? In the first place were patients with tumor diseases, followed by neurological diseases. And by far the most frequent reason for a request for assisted suicide is suffering experienced or feared in the future in the form of existential suffering. I think this is also important. Palliative care physicians criticize the fact that there is still too little funding for the development of palliative care, despite the fact that this has been promised by the legislature. And palliative doctors also a boost to providing information about assisted suicide, even so this is required by law, and they see this as a conflict of values and they feel often burdened. they have chosen, they say, they have chosen this profession precisely because they want to provide palliative care to people, not deal with requests for assisted suicide, they say. This was in a very, very short time, the main points of the Austrian law and some experiences of the past months. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Mr. Platzer. We will have a discussion session after all three of the first referees. So the next one I would like to call to the stand. We're remaining in Austria, Professor Sigrid Müller. She's a professor at the Catholic-Theological Facultät at the University of Vienna. And since 2010, she's also the president of the Association Bioethicists in Central Europe. And her lecture today is titled The Austrian Act on Assisted Suicide, Church and Theological Ethical Reactions. That I would like to give the word to Professor Müller. Mute. You have to unmute.
Okay, I'm sorry. So I would like to give you a short overview over the reactions that came from the Catholic Church and from some theologians on the development of the law and then on the existing law. As you know, as we have heard, the act was had to be prepared in a very short period of time after the Constitutional Court repealed the existing law. There was 1 year of preparation, but in public little was known about the drafting process. There was one consultation in form of a video conference in April that was should help the lawmakers in the preparation of the law, which was called the Dialogue Forum. And then in November, the proposal came out. There was a short period of 3 weeks, which is normal in Austrian law, where people can write comments and criticize or make proposals for amendments. But then it was decided after a year, and it came into existence. So there was very little time for reactions. There are three levels of responses that we can observe. We have as a text that was before the process started, but very briefly before the process started, a document from the Catholic Church, which is called Samaritanus Bonus, the Good Samaritan, who gave the layout of the traditional approach of the Catholic Church on issues of assisted suicide and euthanasia. And then we have the texts or the statements prepared by the Austrian Bishops' Conference, by Caritas and Austrian theologians, who stress more the element of responsibility in this process and solidarity, and later on also freedom. And the theologians who point more at questions that exist and at possible difficulties in theology that still need to be tackled. So let me give you a brief impression how these statements came out. So before the law, the Catholic Church, then after decision of the Constitutional Court statement from the Austrian theological ethicists, then during the Dialogue Forum, which I have mentioned, different associations, but also religious associations and representatives of different religions had a chance to to give their opinion on the topic. And then the Austrian bishops had a statement on the Day of Life on 6th of July in 21. And after the presentation of the draft law, the Austrian Bishops' Conference spoke out again. So what does the traditional argument of the Catholic Church say, which was combined, of which we have a summary in Samaritanus Bonus. It's the protection of life stands in the center of the attention and the enhancement of dignity. So the idea is that if there is a human presence with a person who is dying, it can overcome depression and fear and have a dignified way of dying. And another aspect, which is not very much received nowadays in our society, which is pointing at the fact that suffering cannot completely be abolished through medication or in life at all. That would be an ideology of thinking that life can be without suffering completely. And so that there must also be some acceptance of suffering. But this is not very popular at the moment to say something like that. So other elements of this arguments in Samaritanus Bonus are that the goals therefore must be to strengthen all forms of care, physical care, psychological care, social care, family care, religious care. And there is a red line, which is you should not harm the person. That means there is no killing out of compassion conceivable of. Because this would be linked to a wrong understanding of autonomy, because I think this is a little bit also a Kantian line of argument that if you destroy the person, of course, you destroy the fundament of all moral actions, and also, as the document argues, the fundament of relationships with people, and also the possibility of interacting in prayer with God. So it's a denial of the moral subject itself. And instead, freedom is being looked at in its limited forms. It's important to see freedom not as an ideal, but as something that is always qualified by circumstances. Also dignity that is always present in spite of the limitations. So that in the end, Christians, there's a normative statement, Christians should not put an end to their life themselves, and therefore replace God's decision of when life ends. So no euthanasia and no assisted suicide, a clear statement. On the other hand, because people fear of being in a vegetative state for a long period of time when they are very ill or dying. So there's also the stress on that medical aid should not be overzealous. That means there should not be more medical treatment than necessary. And in this sense, one should also allow the natural process of dying. Then this is a very normative statement, and we could compare it to former statements of the German bishops. And there was a joint declaration of the Protestant Church in Germany and the German Bishops' Conference in 1989, so many years ago. And the statement was a bit more cautious at that time, where there was a distinction made between that one cannot approve of the wish for assisted suicide, but that it also deserves to be respected. So there was more emphasis made on the individual and the individual conscience. And also the Protestant Church usually was stressing more this idea of the respect for the individual conscientious decision. So that there might be existential cases in which mercy can be called for, and that therefore one should also be merciful in the way in which one looks at the different situations. So what did the moral theologians, the working group of the moral theologians, say? They called their text No Pressure for Assisted Suicide. And what they observed, well, I was part of them, so what we observed was that there is we can observe that there's a shift from in the idea, you know, that the state should not interfere in my way, in my life. So they, let's say that the state, that's what the basic what the basic commitment is of the state, that he will safeguard my life. But now it's not only a matter of defending my life against some introducing force of the state, but instead a right of entitlement is discussed, so that there is a shift from a defensive understanding of protecting life to to engaging in interfering with one's life, so that I can also claim that the state should kill me. So this is a new idea that is being introduced in our tradition. And also in the text, we can observe that the idea of letting somebody die, there's a passive attitude, and the active killing, that these differences are not being made any longer. So there is whether somebody actively sets a step or is not distinguished from the passive one. It's rather the result that is being looked at. And if the result is the same, so the argument does not seem to count any longer. This is, let's say, this is relevant for the active way in which other people need to engage in assisted suicide. There's always somebody who needs to help, who has an active part, and which cannot then as easily be criticized any longer. So we see also very strong emphasis on self-determination, which is put in the forefront, and the equally important protection of a right to life is being neglected on the other hand side. So there is a shift that takes place. And we thought that there is a very strong emphasis on the ideal instead on the real limited freedom as it exists in everyday life. So what is the consequence? That one should put more emphasis on the responsibility for other people, for those who are dependent, for those who are vulnerable, as we have heard, and that this solidarity should be strengthened in society, so that nobody who initially did not think of even killing oneself should not be put under pressure through the possibility, to the legal possibility of being killed. So there should be really strong attention to all these aspects. So I will skip what has been said at the discussion forum, because these are all elements that have mainly been introduced into the law, and we have already heard what it says. So let me skip to the presentation of the Austrian bishops. And this is interesting because because of the discussion discussion always was on freedom, also the bishops were concentrating more on freedom and the responsibility and care. And they said, yes, freedom is important, self-decision is important. So it's not only about being obedient to a religious law, it's about self-conscious decision-making, but we should refrain from killing and assist in living and not in killing. So you could see that the discussion was going towards more towards the idea of freedom. And what was very important also that they said the law should not threaten those who want to accept natural death, so that there should not be this shift in the towards a pressure that comes into being through the legal the introduction of the law. And of course, an important request was the strengthening of palliative care and all services. And I think what has been said already by Hans Platzer, the problems of today, like loneliness, are really the pressing arguments in the whole context, and also the fear of missing treatment. And as Hans Platzer said already, the politicians promised to prepare enough facilities for hospices, for palliative care, and they already announced the amount of money, which is quite high, that should be put into the expansion of medical services in order to prevent this shift towards a pressure in law. But on the other hand, since it is dependent on the various political institutions, not only on the national level, but also on the local level and the regional level, there have been difficulties with implementing this. And this is why we have now the law, but we do not have the safety measures that were announced, at least not in the way in which they were announced. Yes, let me stop here because I'm over time. I skipped the theological arguments, but maybe we can raise them during the time of discussion.
Also for minding the time. So we have some questions. We will certainly pose them in the discussion section. Before the discussion section, however, we are also moving to Croatia, where Professor Tonči Matulić is joining us. He is a professor of moral theology and bioethics at the Zagreb Catholic Faculty of Theology since 1999, and in the last 10 years he serves also as the dean of that faculty. And his lecture today is titled Social Consequences of Legalizing Euthanasia, a Changed View of the Value of Life. So, Professor Matulić, I'm now giving you the floor.
Marco, thank you very much. I greet you all, and I wish to thank the organizer, especially Professor Globokarja, for the invitation. So we consider the question about the social consequences of the legalization of euthanasia, a very relevant one. In contrast to the legalization of voluntary abortion, which happened relatively quickly and efficiently in developed European countries during 70s and 80s of the last century, but not without great resistance, in most developed countries, the legalization of active euthanasia began only in this 21st century. And the first country that did so was the Netherlands in April 2002, followed by Belgium in May of the same year. We already know the definition of euthanasia in the Church's moral teaching. By euthanasia is understood an action or an omission which of itself or by intention causes death in order that all suffering may in this way be eliminated. Euthanasia's terms of reference, therefore, are to be found in the intention of the will and in the methods used. So we got the idea of an action, which implies direct active euthanasia, or an omission, which implies indirect active euthanasia. This definition was confirmed by Pope John Paul II in his encyclical letter, Evangelium Vitae, on the value and the inviolability of human life, from 1995. If you can read it, actually he makes a reference to Jura et Bona, previous document. Then recently the same definition was repeated in earlier mentioned the Samaritanus Bonus, a letter of the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith on the care of persons in the critical and the terminal phases of life. And actually it makes references to Jura et Bona and to encyclical letter Evangelium Vitae. In the sense of the above, the legalization of active euthanasia implies the legalization of a crime against human life, since in the act of euthanasia, according to Samaritanus Bonus, one chooses directly to cause the death of another innocent human being. Unlike the few countries that have at least until now legalized active euthanasia, in most European and American countries, there are laws regulating the medical treatment of patients in a terminal incurable state. So in this sense, we are talking about living will, or so-called a legal document that tells doctors how you want to be treated if you cannot make your own decisions about emergency treatment on the one hand, and the so-called passive euthanasia, in our opinion, more appropriate, called palliative care of terminal patients, which has two ethical dimensions. The first ethical aspect occurs in clinical situations in which terminal patients are given strong doses of analgesics for pain relief, which inevitably accelerates the dying process. This is so-called direct passive euthanasia. And another ethical aspect arises in clinical situations where all possibilities of active and effective treatment have been exhausted, so further so-called aggressive therapies are abandoned, but regular palliative therapy is continued, enabling the patient to face the inevitable death with dignity. This is so-called indirect passive euthanasia. In addition to this, what has been said, in most European countries where the living will is illegal, it is a matter of legal recognition of the patient's right to refuse treatment in the terminal phase of incurable disease that will certainly lead to death. And this, of course, with the previously signed informed consent of the patients. And it is possible that this is done by family members or a legal representative instead of patient. The same practice is legally regulated in some non-European countries, mostly in both Americas. Furthermore, it is difficult at this moment to be a true prophet and know how all the social consequences will be caused by the legalization of active euthanasia. The general consequence that we can already assume is that the practice of the legalization of active euthanasia will continue to spread in other countries, encouraged by the examples of countries that have already done so. It is enough to mention the analogous experience of the legalization of voluntary abortion, which points to a kind of continental chain reaction from the 60s or 70s of 20th century to the end of the last century, excluding the countries under the influence of the communist Soviet Union, which had already done so in the 50s of the 20th century, and of course under the influence of the Soviet Union, who had already legalized abortion in 1920. The discussion about the social consequences of the legalization of euthanasia can possibly be conducted analogously to the discussion about the somewhat already known social consequences of the legalization of voluntary abortion. Among these consequences, social unrest should centrally be counted, that is, continuous fierce confrontations between advocates of pro-life and pro-choice positions. Regardless, the message communicated by the subtitle of our lecture seems at this point far more important to us, and that is a changed view of the value of life. Changes in the understanding of the value of human life could certainly be recognized among the causes of the legalization of active euthanasia. Therefore, we should ask ourselves about changes in the understanding of the value of human life, and in the context of euthanasia, this refers to human life in the terminal stages of life, in a state of incurable disease that is often accompanied by severe pain, unbearable suffering. In addition, human life is often found in the state of radical dependence on artificial life support, for example, by means of ventilators, feeding, and hydration. And sometimes it is a case of severe brain damage that leaves the patients in the so-called persistent vegetative state or coma. Therefore, changes in the understanding of the value of human life should be observed in connection with the delicate and tragic conditions of human life in a clinical context, which is what the topic of euthanasia demands. Today, we are faced with a series of paradoxes. First of all, it is paradoxical fact that never in the history of mankind until today has ethical consciousness been more discerning and refined for the inviolable and inalienable value of human dignity of every human person. And we were also warned about this by the Declaration Dignitatis Humanae of the Second Vatican Council. As you can see, the statement from the number 1. It is clear from this statement that the feeling for human dignity is increasingly penetrating the consciousness of today's people, but together with this, the demand to act in accordance with the personal choice of responsible freedom is also penetrating into the consciousness of today's people. And that means without any coercion, but guided by the sense of duty. In light of this, the Catholic view on the legalization of active euthanasia shows a paradox, namely the ethical awareness of inviolable human dignity does not affect in the same way in all people the understanding of the personal right to freedom. This raises the question of understanding the human dignity of dying persons. How it is possible that dying persons with an ethical awareness of their own inviolable human dignity nevertheless demand the right to freely choose active euthanasia as a better solution for ending one's own life than accepting a terminal incurable life, which, however, does not take away human dignity, but only confirms that every human being is vulnerable and mortal, and only through inherent and inviolable human dignity is confirmed true value as human life. Therefore, in the legalization of euthanasia, we recognize a conflict, a kind of contradiction between inviolable human dignity on the one hand and the personal right to freely choose to end one's own life by euthanasia on the other. We wonder how it is that the ethical message about inviolable human dignity, which in active euthanasia must necessarily recognize the violent act of willful killing of a terminal patient, does not reach the ears and hearts of people who insist on justifying the personal right to the act of euthanasia in addition to their ethical awareness of human dignity. The answer to this question should be sought beyond this conflict or contradiction. And in our humble opinion, the answer is hidden in changes in the understanding of human life as a vulnerable and fragile being that is subject to pain and suffering. Decisions for active euthanasia are essentially related to the understanding of human life in the terminal stages of existence in which human life is subjected to pain and suffering, and today for many this is precisely meaningless, humiliating, and unacceptable. When socio-economic reasons are added to that, which in capitalism strongly influence people's ethical awareness, then many do not want to accept the prolongation of a terminal condition, which first represents a burden for the family, then for the healthcare system, but also for society as a whole. Based on what has been said, we arrive at the key question about the meaning of pain and suffering. If the meaning of pain and suffering is not drawn from a certain transcendence and vision of the sanctity of human life, then the shadow of meaninglessness and inadmissibility easily falls on them. In this sense, changes in the understanding of the value of human life should be seen in connection with the influences of the secularization process, which affects the separation and privatization of theological or religious attitudes and arguments from a secular and purely rational attitudes and arguments. If it is not rationally possible to discover and confirm the meaning of pain and suffering, if it is not possible to establish a link between inviolable human dignity and the right to freedom of choice at the end of life, if the ethical awareness of the sanctity of human life does not influence the making of moral decisions at the end of human life, then from such an atmosphere, the demand for the legalization of active euthanasia as a solution to the end of human life is logically imposed. In such an atmosphere, active euthanasia frees the terminal patient from meaningless and humiliating pain and suffering, offers him the possibility of free choice to end his own life, which has become worthless, has lost its dignity, enables him to dot the I in accordance with his own assessment of the quality of life at the moment when life no longer offers of promising him anything, without being guided by the reasons and demands of the ethics of sanctity of human life in all of this. This is clearly emphasized by the following statement of John Paul II, which I'm not going to read, just to save a minute. No matter how understandable and convincing this Pope's statement seemed to us, which I haven't read, however, it should be said that in our current social context, the following statement of the same Pope has the most important weight, namely, all this is aggravated by a cultural climate which fails to perceive any meaning or value in suffering, but rather considers suffering the epitome of evil to be eliminated at all costs. This is especially the case in the absence of a religious outlook which could help to provide a positive understanding of the mystery of suffering, according to his statement in Evangelium Vitae number 15. We believe that the legalization of euthanasia is largely conditioned by the weak influence or total absence of theological and religious positions and arguments based on the ethics of the sanctity of human life and the adoption of state laws in the field of medical practice. In addition, in developed countries, we face another paradox, and let me finish with this, namely, The heavy investment and commitment to the greatest and most effective medical progress in order to provide help to human life in difficult and seemingly hopeless situation gave rise to one, let's say, unwanted side effect, which cannot be observed outside the overall contemporary social context we are talking about. And this side effect is shown in the fact that human life in the clinical context has become somehow controlled life. And I stop here because my time has expired. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much to Professor Matulić. As promised, after the first session, we have about half an hour, a little less than half an hour, for some questions from the audience. Perhaps let me start by thanking all of the contributors. And Professor Müller and Professor Platzer, we were talking about the debate in Austria. I'm especially interested in, Professor Müller, you said about the various declarations or documents that the Catholic Church has prepared in this period, but I'm wondering, how were those documents received by the public? How was the Catholic Church seen in this forum of debate when the legislative process was underway? How was it coordinating with other institutions? And what was the general impression of this public debate that you had?
Maybe Hans can help me out a little bit with, if he wants to add something, because he has also been very much involved in that. What I could say is that the church, of course, was known for being against any change, So I mean, the public already knew what the general position was, but on the other hand, they were not alone, because also the palliative medical physicians were in favor of a very restrictive law, or of not introducing it. So there were the doctors that were are very much engaged with preventing suicide, who felt threatened by the law, because they say they made such a big effort in keeping people from committing suicide, and now there seemed to be the wish seemed to exist to provide a very easy access, instead of helping people to get away from that track of depression. So there were many voices that were supporting the ideas of the church. So it was not alone. And sometimes the other voices were even stronger, than the voices of the churches. I'm not sure, Hans, would you support this?
Yes, I would support it. And I would say the church did not play such a big role in the creation of the law. The bioethics committee was in favor for the law, and as Sigrid Müller said, the palliative physicians, they all, I think, the head of the palliative physicians, they say they don't want this new law, as I said before, because they said it's not our job to do it. And therefore, they are by law not an assisted person. An assisted person is only the man or the woman who goes to the pharmacy and pick up the drug, but not physicians. They want to do not to be involved in law.
What about you mentioned the palliative society and their role in this, and them actually setting up a website, a portal, which is maybe even a little bit more reliable or has more information than the one by the ministry. Could you guide us a little bit through that process? How was that set up? And maybe what's the, let's say, the perception of this palliative society in the Austrian society?
I don't exactly know. They saw there was no many transparency of the Ministry of Health, and therefore the palliative societies yet we make electronic register, and everyone who is interested in it's not the right terminus. Everyone have questioned about this, they can use this electronic register, and you see 60% after they had palliative information about palliative care. They say, no, I don't want to sign a document. But I think the Ministry of Health, maybe there is not so much transparency, because they say less than 10 people, but it's clear now, I think more than 23 people made assisted suicide. I don't know.
What is very interesting about this register is that people who have accompanied people who have committed assisted suicide, or those who wanted to and refrained from doing that, so those people who are involved, they can also write in there. So that we have the expressions and experiences from people, and there's now the effort of having a really academic research into these comments to find out what elements are important, what helped people in refraining from their decision, what were the circumstances. And I think Hans Platzer has really made this the most important insight very strong. This is that it's a female. The phenomenon is mainly female. It has to do with poverty. It has to do with loneliness, with isolation in old age. That means that we see this is not about free decisions in the sense of I do not want to live anymore. It's rather that the circumstances under which I live are not in a way very pleasant, and it's exactly where one could help as a society if there was enough effort and readiness to look at the situations, so that many assisted suicides, or many intents or intentions, or contemplations about that fact, if they are taken seriously, if people are open and listen, and they find out what is happening, and if then there is some help, if there some help can be provided by the society, then many people do not need to think about that. So this is really something that we can learn about. That it's very important to have a good consultation, also with regard to palliative treatment, because many people are afraid of having pains, of suffering pain, and if there's somebody who can explain them what kind of treatment is possible, then many lose their fears. Many people can lose their fears. So the challenge that is in the background in Austria is that is there enough pain treatment? Is there enough knowledge, medical knowledge about pain treatment, and not only in the specialized centers, like in the hospitals, but also on site? So do the practitioners do they have enough formation in pain treatment, in palliative care? So this is the challenge of formation of future physicians, that they also, if they become general practitioners, that they are much more informed about how to treat elderly people and how to do pain treatment, because this can really take away a lot of pressure.
Yes, maybe one. I think this was a very important point. I teach ethics, and I see most students.
Komentar iz izkustva spremljanja več rojakov in ostalih prebivalcev in prebivalk na Švedskem, moram reči kot duhovnik, da sem bil prijetno presenečen nad paliativno oskrbo, predvsem v Göteborgu na Švedskem. Bolnice so bile deležne ljubeče oskrb, in tudi duhovniške zakramentalne pomoči poslednjega mazilja oziroma popotnice. Torej, iz Švedske imamo v bistvu eno pozitivno izkušnjo, je pa zanimivo nasploh, da skandinavske države nimajo teh vprašanj. Ne? To pa je zanimivo, ne? Da tako Švedska, Danska, Norveška pravzaprav nima enega, tudi nisem zasledil nekih pobud. A lahko Zvon, ko poveš, a so kakšne pobude za legalizacijo eutanazije ali pa, če zdaj po mojem ne slišim.
Se slišimo? Se slišimo? Se slišimo? Halo?
Slišimo se super, hvala.
Jasno, hvala za odgovor. Torej, vsekako se, da torej v tem smislu dogajajo stvari. Zdaj, kako daleč so, bi težko rekel, da ne bom kaj krivično rekel, ampak torej iz izkustva, kar se tiče, torej poklicali so me recimo k eni Italijanki, eni Hrvatici, pri naši Slovenki sem bil, moram reči, da torej ta povezava, stik, odgovornost in to zelo lep sprejem in so mi potem tudi pokazali pot v sobo, kjer je oseba odhajala in tako naprej, ampak tudi, koliko sem imel priložnosti, recimo na naše Slovenke, čudovito, no, res čudovito, to čutiš ljubezen, odgovornost do tega, ni samo tisto, sem v službi in tako naprej. Da pa seveda se tudi v tej smeri pogovarjajo glede eutanazije in tako naprej, žal, a ne. To je to, kar bi lahko rekel.
So now a bit of translation for the foreign guests. So we had a sort of like a testimony from Sweden, from our priest who's living there with the Slovenian communities and other communities, explaining that he has a really good experience with the palliative care system, that it works really well. He's been told and he's even seen it. And then Roman asked if in the actually Scandinavian countries, euthanasia is not such a hot public debate. And when Zvonko went online, he explained that he has this experience that he's seen, and he really has perceived this palliative care as being an act of love and responsibility. In a sense, it's not just a job, but he has explained that there are already some debates about the legalization of euthanasia, and some public discourse is happening that way. But perhaps I'd like to also ask a question to Professor Matulić, maybe regarding something that Professor Müller mentioned in her paper, namely the German Bishops' Conference document, which the Austrians leaned on a lot, stating that even though we cannot approve the decision, we need to have some respect for the suffering and for the decision itself from those suffering. Could you maybe reconcile this a little bit with the Catholic outlook, with your perspective? What's your maybe opinion on the matter?
No, I completely agree with that statement. I was just trying to show how the notion or experience or perception of human dignity isn't always adjusted to our experience or feeling of personal choice or our personal experience of freedom. So sometimes we got all these or majority of bioethical issues, they show that from the Catholic perspective, we see the contradiction between the way of exercising of personal choice and freedom at one hand, which is in contradiction or which is putting in question the notion and the experience of human dignity, because we think that the human dignity is the source of the freedom, not the vice versa. Anyway, the Second Vatican Council in the Declaration Dignitatis Humanae pointed out that these two things go together. So I observed that in the euthanasia debates, abortion debates, assisted suicide debates, all these challenges to human life, we cannot not seeing the contradiction or contradiction between these two, let's call them value, human dignity and the freedom. Indeed, we have to protect and to respect freedom, individual freedom, but respecting individual freedom means respecting human dignity, even when this individual freedom chooses the acts that are against human dignity. And this is the meaning of the statement of the German Bishops' Conference. I completely agree with that.
Questions from the room?
Jaz mislim, da je potrebno bistveno več diskusije in opredeliti, kaj je dejansko res suffering, kaj je dignity in kaj je tisto, kar je neznosno trpljenje. Te entitete, mora vsaka stroka, tako v medicini, kot v psihiatriji in v psihologiji, tudi v sociologiji, obvezno vsaka svoje mnenje povedati, ne samo povedati, mi se moramo med seboj diskutirati, da točno nekako skušamo bliže priti, kaj je res tisto, kar povzroča bolniku neznosno trpljenje, ali pa povsem neznosna izguba, povsem izguba digniteta, ne, se pravi, spoštovanja. In mislim, da v Sloveniji, ko se jaz pogovarjam tako z ljudmi okrog sebe, v svoji vasi, mladi temu nima nič dosti pojma, niti izkušenj osebnih, kaj je dejansko trpljenje ali pa izguba samospoštovanja zaradi bolezni, v primerjavi z starejšimi ali pa tistimi, ki so izobraženi. In ti mladi, ki bodo pa seveda na referendumu, pa v parlamentu, pa na različnih medijih, najbolj glasni in najbolj vplivali, da so tisti, ki to bolj razumejo, danes v stroki, jih obnašajo, da niso manj, da niso srčeni. Torej, pregledali bi tak zakon so. Tako odločitev na kakršnem nivoju je potrebno veliko delati. Ampak predvsem tudi vsake stroke, ki izgleda. Ker mi zdravnik se ne zdravnik, ima že pa je zdravnik, ki je v researchu ali pa zdravnik in laboratorij ima čim drugačno, pa so vsi zdravniki. Predvsem mlade v srednjih šolah in fakultetah je treba v tem odločiti, kako je treba spoštovati starejšega človeka in mu pomagati, da ni sam. Kot je rekla kolegica, da so deske, da je več srpljenja, smo malo kot moške. Seveda, deske nobena tedina, malo zdaj sem tedina. In tukaj je te stvari malo bolj natančno, ker bi rado prišlo do zlorab, oziroma da se to predpostavi, tako kot na Nizozemskem, da se preveč organizira, več samomoru, tako, da to je komentar, in da več slišali.
Hvala, prevedem. So a short translation. So the lady emphasizes that there needs to be a lot more of discussion, especially as to what really constitutes this unsufferable suffering, this complete degradation of human dignity. And this should really be a professional debate discussion where each of the branches of science dealing with this contribute. So as does the medicine, as does the psychology, psychiatry, sociology. So within these branches, and a joint public discussion is needed to determine what it is that forces this unbearable, hopeless situation. As it was also mentioned that it's not clearly defined. And one problem with this might arise that from her personal experience, there are those young people who have no real life experience, have no idea what it means to really lose your self-respect due to illness or deteriorating conditions. And these young people will likely be very active in the public debate and will mark those trying to enforce some sort of respect for human life as being unhumane, as being not understanding of their situation, while not having real experience, and leading towards a situation where we could have real societal pressure on people, maybe similar to that of Netherlands, where we have evidence proof that the suicide rates, the assisted suicide rates, and the euthanasia rates increase before the vaccination. So there needs to be this discussion, and we need to be able to share some wisdom with young people in high schools, in universities, as today get a little bit more of an understanding of what this real unbearable suffering might be. You have any comments from our guests?
Maybe we can watch. I have said it as at the Austrian Constitutional Court. I think you will know it. There are different understandings of dignity. Both the proponents and opponents of euthanasia are true with dignity. The first said it's against dignity to actively end a life before it ends, and the second say not being allowed to die is against dignity. And yes, you have been more discussion about what is dignity, what does it mean? But I think many people feel this is against dignity in this situation.
Because we got the two different approaches to the dignity. So the dignity is primary and the fundamental value from which freedom and all other values stems. And so in this sense, the freedom should always be frameworked and valued in the light of dignity. And then vice versa, if you take a freedom as a fundamental value from which stems out the human dignity, then indeed this is the consequence. Anyway, I mentioned that this is actually the meaning of the declaration of the German Bishops' Conference, not only of that. We believe that freedom comes or stems out from the human dignity, and we anyway have to respect the freedom, because the freedom coming from the dignity always brings forth the human dignity. Anyway, if you are doing, I don't know how many wrong acts, you always have to respect the human dignity, the person. Just judge the act, not the person. Thank you.
Yes, what is also commented often by physicians is that the degree in which you can live with pain can vary a lot. And also it can vary over time, so that many people, when they are younger, they cannot imagine to live in a certain state. And when they have reached that state, they still find something positive and want to continue living. And there are many reports also about assisted palliative care at home, where there is a minimal way of being able to live one's life compared as to young people. And still there are ways of enabling minimal decisions, minimal autonomy, so where life still can be experienced as something positive. So there are so many varieties, and I agree with the comment that young people might fight for freedom because this is what they can understand, what is their, let's say, in their way in which they understand it, and they might look at it differently when they are growing older. But I'm not sure how we can maybe only by having statements from elderly people who can make a balance to this effort made, that the public can see there is not only one understanding of freedom, and that compromised freedom can still be experienced as sufficiently free. Yes, the sufficient freedom. I think this is a challenge. I think this is a challenge when it comes to public voices, to make a very broad, to have a very broad representation of voices.
Thank you. Maybe one more. Yeah.
Ja, bom kar v slovenščini. Mislim, da nekako manjka nek strokovni odziv, koliko dejansko je tisti procent ljudi, ki v nekem tem terminalnem stanju tudi doživljajo seveda neko zelo težko ali pa hudo bolečino trajno, ker se pač na drugi strani velikokrat igra na to karto, da je temeljni vzrok za ta zakon odpravljanje trpljenja. Zdaj vemo, da medicina je šla zelo naprej, tehnologija tudi, ampak ne pomaga tega jasnega sporočila, da je tega objektivnega trpljenja, fizičnega trpljenja verjetno, vsaj v teoriji, zelo malo, in so to izjemno redki primeri, in da če vsi sistemi delujejo, te lahko to bolečino odpravljajo. Lahko pogrešam to realno številko, večkrat slišimo, ja, večina primerov, pa 30 primerov, pač nekako znanstveno utemeljeno, ali večkrat bolj statistično opredeljeno, koliko je res objektivno, fizično te bolečine. Pustimo zdaj psihološko, socialno, to je zdaj nek drug vidik, ampak prav dejansko, da velikokrat se to besedno promovira, da je ta zakon in ta način ravno zgodba tega trpljenja neznosna. Kaj je to objektivno izmeriti, pa se sploh obstaja ta podatek?
Yeah, so the gentleman states that he's missing a sort of realistic, objective information about how many of the patients in terminal conditions of their diseases are in fact suffering this immense amounts of pain, physical pain, because we know that the technology has advanced, medicine has advanced, and things going accordingly, we should be able to prevent a great deal of this physical suffering. But what we hear in public debates, and often for the promotion of the necessity of this law, is that we have a lot, or that we have the majority of, or that we have, so we have the stories of the people who really are feeling this pain and the unbearable pain, but we're lacking a sort of realistic perspective, scientific, from the field of how many people are really suffering through this. And
praktično, rečem, zadnji desetletji, prej je bilo drugače, pa zadnji desetletji, da ni bolnika, ki bi neznosno za te bolečine, ker so lahko taka zdravila že na razpolago, ko je damo lahko v visokih dozah, ne samo to, v kombinaciji različnih zdravil prijemajo na ljudi in se razvijajo in neustavno Tako da se to je tisto, kar se ne sprejema. Vsaka stroka mora povedati, kdaj je pacient res v neznosnem trpljenju in kaj pa medicina v tistih problemih ne more rešiti. Tako da jaz mislim, da tega ni.
Thank you. So with this we'll conclude just a brief summary. So the doctor has experience from lung cancer and diseases, and she said that in the last 5-10 years with the advances, there are practically no patients who would suffer intolerably because we have different combinations of medicine, we have dosage variables that we can increase, and so there is no real need for anyone to suffer in that field, at least. And this is also a reason why it would be necessary for the science to actually have a voice and to voice their opinions. With this, I would like to thank all three of our guests who joined us through Zoom, and all of the participants in the room for the participation in the first session. Thank you, Professor Müller, Professor Matulić and Professor Platzer. In hvala vam za to pozornost. Se dobimo nazaj ob 15 do 11 z naslednjo sekcijo.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
Thank you.